So let's talk about faith as being active versus passive.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that I suggested we talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's two. We want to be careful how we define active and passive, right? We're not saying that faith isn't something that I should be doing in my heart. Like when I hear the gospel, I'm called to believe, and I exercise that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is active in that sense, and I was trying to say that earlier with what it means that faith is a gift. However, what we don't want to do is turn faith into like a good work that I offer to God. I'm not accepted before God because I had faith. I'm accepted before God because through faith I received the gift of righteousness. And that's what we mean by it. It's a passive faith. I'm not actively working righteousness when I exercise faith, because even my faith is going to be tainted out of a sinful self. Even with the Holy Spirit there, I still have sin in this life, in this body. So I never produce my own righteousness that will bring me into the presence of God. What faith does, though, is it grabs hold of Christ, and the righteousness that I get then as given to me is Christ's righteousness. So it's passively receiving. It's not to say faith is unimportant. I'm bringing salvation comes through faith, right? But not because of faith. I don't merit things because I believed. I don't earn my salvation because I believed. God doesn't ascribe a special value to my faith that makes me more worthwhile. I mean, faith is absolutely important, and without faith it's impossible to please God. But it's not me giving something to God where it's like a quid pro quo that he gives me something back and we just swap this out. It's me coming as a beggar saying, I need this and I need you to give me. And so classical theology has kind of had that idea that faith is passive in that sense. You're exercising it, but you're just holding your arms out and saying, I need you, Jesus, and I'm trusting in you.
Yeah, our faith will be the result, not the cause.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, a good analogy that I've used, and this kind of picks up on something, I've modified it a little bit, but something Calvin had said is just when you get water, the water is what quenches your thirst, but the water comes through something to you. So in our case, we go to the spigot, and we don't when we get our thirst quenched, we don't praise the spigot and be like, wow, this faucet is so phenomenal. I've got this water because my thirst is quenched because of the faucet. No, the water came through the faucet, but the thirst is quenched by the water. My need before God is quenched by the righteousness of Christ and Christ. I receive that through faith, but I don't give the credit for the righteousness. I don't give the credit to my faith. I give the credit to Christ. And again, we want this balance of faith. Absolutely is important. It is by faith alone, and we don't combine it with works, but don't make faith itself sort of a backhanded work that reaches out and does something by its own might and power.
That's good.
Lynette had a good question. She said, what role does faith have in God moving, healing, etc., in light of his sovereignty? We see often where God says, your faith has made you whole, or ye of little faith.
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
We'll punt that one to Los.
Answer your wife, Los. Answer your wife.
Hey, you were just saying you guys are one. So.
That's a question I would have asked Tim.
Look, see, they both would have asked the same question.
Yeah. All right, I'll take a crack at it. I appreciate the question. Certainly, I do think it's right and good to say the Lord delights in faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You look at Hebrews 11 and the heroes of the faith. And so there are times where he uses faith as the means. And you see it in the Gospels, like she's quoting there, your faith has made you well. He often talks to, I can't think of where it is now in the Gospels where he goes to heal that guy and the guy says, look, I believe, help my unbelief. So there's even that tension there. I think what you want to steer away from is this idea of faith being rewarded in a straight like one-to-one And certainly, when you see someone that says, like you're praying and you're not being healed for something, you don't want to throw them under the bus and say, well, you didn't have enough faith. I mean, just look at the Psalms and look at some of the low positions David finds himself in. And you would never look in and say, well, David just didn't have enough faith in those moments. I mean, he absolutely did. And yet at the same time, God is pleased to oftentimes look at someone's faith and say, yeah, you've trusted in me. I'm gonna lift you out of this as the result of your trust. But the flip side of that isn't necessarily true. If he doesn't lift someone out of an illness, say they have cancer and they pray and they have real faith that he's going to save them if that's his will, it doesn't mean that their faith wasn't sincere or real.
Right.
And I think that's the key, that there are times where God says, yeah, your faith has made you well. That doesn't mean the reverse is necessarily true, that if you weren't made well, it was because you didn't have enough faith. I think there's a mystery to just God's grace in that ultimately it's his will and his sovereignty that with those types of things, whether he heals or not.
Yeah. I think simply put, we ask according to his will and trust him regardless of the outcome. And he will at times use our faith in his sovereign work. And there are times where God says no. And so people assume, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but people have made faith into almost like, you can strong arm God to do things that he wouldn't have done before. But that's not the case. I think our job isn't to know the mysteries of God and to know his mind in all things. Our role is to trust him, petition him because he told us to. He loves when we come and ask him, according to his will, though. And I think that we don't look for results, but we just look to trust him, petition, and ask him. If someone came to our church and asked for the elders to pray, we would pray and pray for their wholeness and for them to be healed. But we don't look for results. We believe that God can. We don't assume that God has to or will.
Yeah, the other thing is, too, I think look at the Gospels, and even when Jesus says things like, "O ye of little faith," he still does some works in front of them. And so there's
Right.
there's a gentle rebuke there, but there's also a lot of grace. Even, it always amazes me, like you read Hebrews 11 and the Hall of Heroes of the Faith kind of thing. But some of those guys that are listed there, like Gideon, he had some real problems having faith right off the bat, throwing out the fleece and
Right.
gets himself into trouble later in life. And yet, he's still a hero of the faith. And you look, and yet these guys had flaws and their faith wasn't always strong and perfect.
Right.
And I think that's a good lesson for us when you think about trusting Christ. Yeah, I'm not going to get it right all the time, but it's not my strength and my abilities to trust. If I'm struggling in my trust, God delights when we ask him for help with that.
And there's a mystery to that too. It's all about the sovereignty of God, and then him calling us to ask him and how all that works. We can't put it together, but we know that he told us to, that he delights in it, and we're his children, and so we do petition. We do ask, and he knows what we need. So that's what we do. We're not called to figure everything out about God. We're just called to depend and rely on him for everything we need.